Hello and welcome to the Stock Out. This is your show at FreightWaves for all things related to CPG and retail industries. I'm your host, Mike Baudendistel, and today what I thought we'd do, in light of the fact that Grace is still out, would be to have a crossover episode and bring on Thomas Wasson of Loaded and Rolling. And so the idea is, Thomas, you follow the truckload carriers very closely. A lot of the content that you write targets that community, those asset heavy, carriers. And I thought what we do is, since this show focuses on retail and CPG companies, I'll just ask you some of the questions that I would ask if I was a retailer or CPG company, and so just sort of target some of what you've put together for that audience. I think that'll make a good show.
And I think this is a great conversation to have because we aren't that coming past the inflection point. And so there's a lot of big questions coming up as we move towards peak season, December, and even things like October, like Halloween, Christmas. We have a lot of holidays coming up. So a lot of questions for sure.
Okay. So as far as where the freight market is sort of right now, you're of the view we're sort of past the bottom. Seasonally things are going to improve. A lot of the stuff you've written about has been, saying that, we're sort of past, let's say we're past the bottom, you're past the inflection point, as you just sort of pointed out. What do you see as sort of the biggest piece of evidence that the freight market is in fact turning? And then what do you think are the biggest risks to maybe it doesn't turn as quickly as we're expecting?
Well, I think the biggest things, thinking that it's turning, I like to go two approaches. I'm looking at the sonar data. Tender rejection rates are still, they're below 5%, but they're remaining resilient. They're much better compared to this time last year. We're around that 4.36, right? Now, ROTR, I look at reefer 8.6. So we're seeing the seasonal bumps in reefer if you look at this timeline. And then you're looking at dry van tender rejections 4.36. So that's one sign that we're at the bottom, and it's this very early stage. The other one, looking at earnings calls. So we're starting to hear that when, carriers and trucking executives, when they feel comfortable saying that the worst is behind us, they're typically maybe a quarter behind. No one wants to be the first one to say it, and then it turns out someone says you're wrong. But it does look like even from Q1 and Q2, the two big things I've been hearing and reading about was that, one, things are getting better, but not really great yet. And two, we're not cutting our rates anymore because the environment's so rough that we're finally starting to think of who's still asking for cuts right now, and those are going to be at the bottom of the list in service when the market flips.
Gotcha. So if you're a shipper now, in light of all of that, you've had a couple of years of just things being easy, where it's been easy to source capacity. Rates have come down quite a lot. Have really come down a lot in some of the sectors I cover, intermodal, a couple of years in a row. But how would you advise a shipper right now, CPG company or retail, to position themselves? It sounds like you don't want to be too aggressive if the market is in fact turning.
It's definitely one part of the equation. Whenever this happens, you've had a situation where it feels like you can just get trucks. So you really bully your carriers on tender compliance rates. I want you to accept as much as you can, preferably at those low rates and RFPs. Second thing is, when does the RFP happen? If you've just concluded your RFP, or do you have an RFP that's coming up? That's another big question, because if I had just got some single digit rate concessions in Q1 and Q2, I know that right now that is going to be a little bit of a balancing act moving into Q3 and Q4. So I may get some mileage. So how long has historically you seen with your internal data between your RFP, depending upon years? So if you're a very long-tailed CPG company, if you've been around for like 30, 40 years, look at that data and see, because there's always a difference between the price you're paying and then when the carriers stop throwing it back. Call that paper rates, by the way. Paper rates is a fun Chicago term, where it just becomes worthless as the paper was wrote on. And then if you have upcoming RFPs, start having the conversation with your carriers. Find out, you can start getting some ideas in terms of back channeling. Are we going to stays the same, I would shoot for low single digits or flat. Maybe like a 1 or 2% bump. You want to lock in the carriers coming up in Q3 and Q4 in a favorable enough position that they're going to be, keeping with it. They're not going to turn it into paper rates. And then finally, looking at your own internal operations. Are you getting feedback from carriers? Are there issues at your facilities? Are you not a shipper of choice, or are you a shipper of choice? I hope you figured that out by now if you're a large CPG company. But that's going to be another thing to look into, is that we look at the rate component, we look at the compliance and service levels. Obviously, if a carrier is like 80% on time service or 75% on time, we need to have some conversations. Because you can get away with like 80, 85% when tender rejections are like 10% and the market's hot. But if you're doing an 80, 85% and it's talking like a live load, you want to make your list internally as well. So at the end of the day, it's going to be very strategic. It's very much an art as it is a science. You've got these relationships with carriers who also
Mhm.
view you
Mhm.
as a part of their mix. And so it is a two-way street at this point if you're a CPG customer. And I think the biggest thing is reward those who are servicing your freight, who are accepting your tenders, and then make sure that those who aren't kind of figure out if it's something you can keep in your network. If not, we'll look on the order of how you're tendering your loads. Who's your primary? Who's the incumbent? Pick your incumbents wisely as we approach when the market starts getting better, because that incumbent that you thought was your incumbent may not be if your rate is low or if your characteristics don't fit.
Gotcha. So you don't want to have the absolute lowest rate. And it sounds like if you concede something on rates, give your carriers a little bit of an increase, sort of recognize that freight market does seem to be showing some green shoots, if you will, that can really go a long way. I also want to ask you, when you compare the spot rates right now to the contract rates, the spot rates have been below contract for some time. That's a good exhibit of that from Sonar. How should a shipper think about balancing that in terms of, you can get a lower rate using the spot market right now, but that might leave you out in the cold later on?
You want to approach it kind of in a situation where your lanes. So what a good one, the research is called ghost lanes. So these are lanes that in an RFP, carriers have dedicated capacity for. They've been awarded these lanes, but they actually just don't show up. So it may be something where you're awarded a load that's once a month, for instance. So I think
Mhm.
for these customers, when we're looking at the spot market versus the contract market, you want to really take into consideration for that bottom one at the $1.88. Those are going to be your semi-random lanes you can't predict. A big thing you can mess up easily in a relationship with a carrier is that you say that it's going to be 30 loads a month, and it turns out that maybe half the year it's like 5 or 10. And then that turns into like that ghost lane. And so then the carrier actually allocated trucks thinking you were going to get some freight. Inside their mix, even large carriers, they're taking into account what you say you're going to give them as part of their totals. And so that's going to be something really important to consider looking ahead, is that a smart company would take that information and look at their entire business and say, well, maybe that needs to go to a freight broker. And that's one thing brokers do really well, by the way, is on demand capacity. And right now, with rates still being very low, maybe that 10% of your network that you used to carve out for brokerages and semi-random routes, maybe that actually turns into 30%. And maybe your RFP becomes what you actually can consistently deliver. And it takes a lot of the guesswork out. It makes your carrier relationships easier. And it's a win all around.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is sort of how to effectively use brokers. So that was a good point there. It's not predictable. Maybe it should go to a broker. One of the things that's been brought up on FreightWaves is that shippers are more willing to use brokers for a larger portion of their freight than they used to be. Do you think that shipper, it makes sense to have, sort of a few core carriers that, like you said earlier, they sort of trust, they've worked with before, and then have a broker as kind of a core carrier for these difficult to predict lanes? Is that a good approach, or would you recommend something else?
I think we used to call it, I think at the future of supply chain, they called it the old 5 and 1, five asset based
Mhm.
carriers and one broker. I'm going to take the flip approach. For those semi random lanes, 5 brokers and one asset based carrier. Do the 5 and 1 for what you need moved. Make sure it's priced to move correctly. But at the same time, on those, have that tertiary, have that backup where you may have a 5 and 1 in your routing guide for 30%. You got to figure out the biggest thing to do, and transportation managers and CPG companies, everyone's afraid of this idea that if I don't have a carrier locked in, I'm screwed. Like that's one of the oldest, biggest mistakes ever because you're also screwing over the carrier. Nowadays, with the technology we have at hand, you don't have to lock in a carrier for one load a quarter. You don't have to award that in an RFP. Award it to a broker and say, I need you to do this. But also, if you screw this up, I'm going to like pass it to two or three other brokerages. They're hungry for it. They can figure that out. I think that at the end of the day, you have to really ask yourself, how's the performance of the brokerages that you have allowed into your contract mix, that you've allowed to compete with asset-based carriers? How are they performing? But also, like, is this a historical fluke? So that's the big question looking ahead, because a brokerage is only as good as the rate they have and the margin they can sustain. And even if they have drop trailer, even if they're moving 100 loads a week in a certain direction, if they're underwater, they may not take losses. They may pull out and hand it back. The big question moving forward with the end of the freight recession and the upswing is the brokers have clawed into a carrier's network, but can they keep it? Historically speaking, brokerages are very adverse to being underwater on lanes. And if you have a win in a bid that's Q1 and Q2, like we said with RFP earlier, there's a big risk. And I really don't know the answer. I'm very fascinated to watch because we could see it play out one of two ways. We could see maybe brokerages continue to service at really well levels if trucks are no longer cheap and plentiful, or we'll see a situation where both carriers and brokers will start handing it back because it turns out maybe you weren't the coolest shipper you thought you were, and not gonna, you're not a shipper of choice, and it just never reached you. So that's a very big question. I think at the end of the day, you want to look at what's the mix of drop trailer as well. How am I turning those trailers? Am I using them for storage? Am I lay the foundation of a good relationship by making sure your own internal supply chain is in good standing, because you could have a situation where you may not be the best at rates, but you're actually a really quick shipper. The carrier is going to value that. Now, if you're a really crappy shipper and you detain drivers, you hate to have to pay, you're like 90 days to pay for your brokerages. You just really have, and that's a strategy, by the way, because your transportation department's like, I'm saving you so much money. Your traffic guys are like, yeah, look at me, I'm a rock star, we're having low costs. Well, don't be surprised if your costs suddenly skyrocket because it turns out you sucked.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So the brokers have taken a lot of share of the overall freight market the last however many years. That's been pretty dramatic, but we could get in a situation where maybe we're past most of the that market share gain. So it will definitely be something interesting to watch. Also wanted to ask you, some of what's been in the news lately has been the Knight-Swift recently acquired another LTL carrier to sort of build out its LTL network. Not really a surprise after they did the initial one that they would want to have a nationwide network of LTL. To sort of match the nationwide network of truckload. Do you think for a CPG company, a lot of CPG companies will use a combination of LTL and truckload, right? So sometimes it's worthwhile to consolidate, LTL shipments into truckload shipments. Is there an advantage to using a carrier like, let's say, Knight-Swift, once it has full nationwide coverage of both LTL and truckload, versus something that
if they can give you a deal,
separate?
If they give you a deal, there's an advantage if they can use that vertical integration and they actually provide the value. I mean, at the end of the day, as a shipper and a carrier, if I'm shipping my goods and if I'm the transportation person, Knight-Swift come to me and says, I can cut you a good deal. We just open up these terminals on the West Coast. Give me some of this volume. You're going to give them a option, find out their price, but also understand that, I would test them on a few lanes first. Give them an RFP, see if they can do it. Some stuff that I may not, if you have trusted relationships in the LTL space, LTL is one of those situations where if I have Old Dominion or somebody and then Knight-Swift's asking me, I'm not going to tell Old Dominion to pound sand. They're a very well run carrier. You just have to think that if the savings are there and the service is there. At the end of the day, it's all about service and savings. The trucking carriers love to expand into LTL. We also see Hunt. Hunt is half intermodal, a third dedicated. Hunt's not really an over-the-road trucking carrier. Hunt is an intermodal player. And so when we're looking at these decisions, at the end of the day, as much as I'm biased as a trucking expert to say, yeah, give the truckers a chance, I worked in operations, and you have to service the freight. If you can't service the freight, it doesn't matter how many cool things you have. just like a Heartland. Doesn't matter how good your OR is, a Heartland at 85. If you buy two crap companies and they're still 100 plus, they're going to drag you down. I came from US Express. Take it from me. We were like the 195 OR gang all day to get every day. So, it's one of those situations where I would highly recommend, you can introduce them to your network for some lanes that are less risky. See if they do have a good fit, but you want to take a very methodical approach. Just because it's shiny, just because it's new, just because their sales VP is offering you all this stuff, you need to see if they can deliver. Just like with freight brokerage, this is an industry that runs on doing your job well. So there ain't no charity cases in trucking at the end of the day. We'll have to see how they integrate it. I'm very confident that they will. They've got it under one of the umbrellas. It's not MME. It's one of the AAA Cooper, I think, is the one that Knight Swift has it under. And so they'll figure it out. But it's kind of like buying a new car. You ever buy a new car and there's like kinks in it? You look at the Cybertruck, like crap's falling off of it. Treat a truckload carrier that just bought some LTL players. Treat it like a brand new model. Maybe you just need to wait a year or two, and they'll get the model refresh, or like an iPhone. The first one has glitches. Kind of think of it like that. If you need to persuade your boss, don't bet the farm on probably a much lower cost, because they're probably going to offer a lower cost just to get market share.
Always a good idea to not go all in on version 1.0 of a product. For sure. Although in Dallas, I think I've seen every like brand new model out in the wild. People like to spend a lot of money on cars here. But speaking of service, you bring up service is really critical. And then another area where it's really critical is intermodal. And that's one thing that people have been pretty complimentary of intermodal lately has been the rail service. It's a lot better than it was. Maybe that's just because it went through this period of just poor service, and the company's resourced up. There's a lot of pressure put on them by STB, by shippers, and intermodal volumes been booming, both internationally and domestic. I guess one thing that's been maybe a little bit of a difference of opinion here has been just how much shippers can save using intermodal in sort of the local east lanes. And I have a sonar chart that shows the savings rate across a few different segments. And so basically what we do here at FreightWaves, our data team takes 5-digit origin destination pairs that are the same for both truckload and intermodal that run on the same week. And a lot of times it's the same shipper has unique shipper ID that we see. And it shows that in these long haul lanes, it's about a 16% savings. Okay, that sounds about right. And then sort of the mid haul is about 6%. There's the shorter haul, which is 400 to 800 miles, about 4%. So that's kind of what we've seen in a lot of our data. But we did see here something very different from Hub Group, the big domestic intermodal company. They said that sort of that longer haul, it's more like a 30% discount, and then in the local east lanes, more like a 20% discount. So they think they have an incentive to say, well, this is using intermodal is great. They're the intermodal provider, but I just wanted to hear from your perspective. Have you heard any anecdotes about intermodal being good value right now versus truckload?
Not anecdotally yet, but historically and operationally, we really like to do. Even when I was a broker, we would just put it on intermodal. If you didn't need it anywhere, they'd get mad, and you tell them you'd put it on truckload, but if it was real cheap, you just put it on rail. And then they found out, and then sometimes they'd not give you any more freight because you basically took the marginal, that extra 15-20% savings. You took that, and that was actually your margin, and the shipper gets mad. But I mean, the biggest conversations what I'm hearing has been, you had some really great commentary about the shipping intermodal between your domestic, like your 53-foot and your 40-foot shipping containers, putting if those are going on the rail or not. There's a conversation piece in like Q1 with Hunt. It's one of those things where for trucking, it's very attractive to put it on a truck right now if the rates are cheap. Because it's just one of those things where why would I still put it on a train and then have it take extra time where I'm like, I can just say it's all about savings. And we'll see a situation where the big question will be if truckload capacity gets tightens and actually really tightens, which I don't think we have any inkling that it's going to flip like drastically. It may just be a slow burn, it may be low and slow, like Texas barbecue thinking here. But if that does happen, can intermodal capitalize on that? it's always to me one of those situations where intermodal works really well in certain areas. Are you going from large hubs from nationwide? Like
Mhm.
I'm thinking like California, like LA to Dallas, Dallas, Chicago, Atlanta, parts of that. And so I think at the end of the day, the savings index is important, but from how I've understood it, there's always been, if you're a very CPG or shipper, you already have a decision in place about what's your intermodal versus truckload mix. And so we may see a little bit of changing, but it does appear to be, from how I've read it and stuff, that if you're going to keep an X amount on rail, you're just going to keep X amount on rail. There's only so much car space on train tracks, trucking capacity. You and I can get a motor carrier. We can add capacity really quick. With rails, there's only so much rail. So, you don't want to give all that up if it turns into a situation where, the rails start having some challenges. So that's why I've been curious with the imports and stuff is one thing I do want to know is if it's hitting rail first before it hits truckload. That's kind of the big question. That's what because we typically think that more import stuff coming on the West Coast will mean a boon for trucking. But at the same
Mhm.
time, like it does take a little bit of time for the dust to settle to see is trucking actually getting that share or is it actually going for intermodal? And intermodal, when I've been reading up on it, has been a situation where they want to be able to tout that they've been making improvements and they take on more. They've been trying to price accordingly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's an interesting anecdote when JB Hunt reported that they said that they had not seen a commensurate increase in volume out of the West Coast, given how much, import volume there has been. So it suggests there's maybe more warehousing in the West Coast. And I would agree with you. There's not a tremendous amount that shifts back and forth quickly between the modes. I think, when I worked in finance, there was a perception that when fuel prices increased a little bit, that there'd be a lot of freight went to the rail, and then it decreased and went back to the truckload. It's really kind of, shippers planning their networks and looking at, where it makes sense and kind of dipping a toe in and intermodal, and if the service is good, maybe give it a little bit more. So it takes a little bit longer than people expect. You have a couple minutes left. Wanted to ask you, on the dedicated side, I mean, some of these carriers you follow, like Werner, big, in dedicated, what are the rough economics of when that makes sense for a shipper? Like when would a shipper be a good candidate for a dedicated contract? I gather he has to have lots of volume and be able to fill up those trucks, but any other insights would be great.
Well, the first one you want to ask yourself, if we're looking at it from the shipper standpoint, is what's the cost? Do I have a private fleet or have I always had it? Am I using third parties for my distribution warehouse? Do I own my own warehouses and distribution centers? And then, it's one of those situations where for truckload carriers, they really like dedicated. Look at Werner, look at Knight Swift at US Express, between 30 and 50, probably between 40 and 50, upwards of maybe 60% of their trucks are in the form of dedicated where they take over DC. When I worked in trucking, we had like Dollar General dedicated, Target dedicated. You would make decisions with them. And I think, honestly, like this is my personal take. I think having for hire trucking companies take over your DCs, it may be a smart play if there's organized labor. I mean, you can just fire all the Teamsters
Mm-hmm.
and just have them run your DC. I always wondered if that was something that they would use it for, honestly, because it'd be very easy to have your drivers try and unionize. And we saw that with some stuff in the news where a dedicated location tries to unionize. And then, the trucking company's like, oh no. So I do wonder if that's one of the plays because the turnover is just high enough. It's harder to get them to organize. But at the end of the day, it's like the carrier, you have to ask yourself, do I get the better savings and value by having it outsourced? And then is this something that can also help me in other segments? Because, you can haggle with carriers. Hey, look, I'll give you some dedicated. I'll let you try out a few more DCs, but maybe give me a better deal on X, Y, and Z lanes in my network. That's one of the things. I mean, from a standpoint, carriers are real attractive because they can ramp up real quickly. I used to do that stuff for like Tractor Supply and a few others. We do dedicated packages. So that's all about the cost. It's really just for a shipper, it's like money and can they do it better than I can?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. One last quick one here. I mean, sometimes you hear carriers make profit off of their fuel surcharge. Not necessarily, maybe they price the fuel surcharge off of 6 miles per gallon, but they have all the latest aerodynamic features and they can get 7 miles a gallon. How does the shipper make sure they're treated fairly on fuel?
If you decide to make your fuel surcharge less, they're just going to gouge you in line haul. I mean, that's how it's going to happen. Or what happens is it's an all-in rate at the end of the day, and when I saw analysts, that's what we do: all-in rate, take out a little bit for fuel. Now, what the concern is, if fuel goes down, then you're underwater because your line haul was too low. So yeah, I would say like keep it competitive, use best practices, benchmark it, use an agreed upon third-party fuel surcharge. At the end of the day, if you do screw with it, they're just going to find another way to charge you.
They're just going to find another way to charge you. Sounds like life in 2024. But thanks so much for your time, Thomas. And where can people find your newsletter, Loaded and Rolling?
Yeah, check it out. FreightWaves.com/loaded and rolling. Live show Tuesdays, 2 p.m. Eastern. Newsletters Thursdays, 2 p.m. Good stuff. All about trucking.
Sounds great. Hope everyone has a good day.